This next part, he talks about the fears of nuclear war. And I think this was written about just after the Cold War, or maybe during. So there was all kinds of fears about, and a lot of sci-fi writers wrote about it. Asimov and A.C. Clarke and then Carl Sagan wrote about that this was like a tipping point, that the human race will either wipe itself out with nuclear war or it will continue. And they even kind of speculated that other species will go through this too, and some of them will wipe each other out, and that'll be the end of that species. The human race's fate was not decided yet. And some people might even say that today it isn't really decided yet. And he talks about what would be the story of a nuclear war. What would happen on Earth? What would we have to deal with? So first of all, he starts out with some actual examples. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan were nuked with, I think it was hydrogen bombs. So not the kind of nuclear weapons we have today. Weaker versions of those things. And the kinds of radiation that occurred there was measured and studied, and some of the island populations were also affected. So he says here that, so not many people died from the explosion on these islands, but the radioactive strontium they ate was concentrated in their bodies, and the radioactive iodine was concentrated in their thyroids. 2/3 of the children and 1/3 of the adults later developed thyroid abnormalities, growth retardation, or malignant tumors. So that wasn't the actual effect on peoples near Japan. This is on page 266. So he says on the next page that if there were to be a nuclear war across the world, not everyone would die from the blasts and the fires, but the radiation, the radioactive material, would last a long time. He says that 90% of the strontium 90 will decay in 96 years. 90% of the cesium 137 in 100 years, and 90% of the iodine 131 in a month. So a lot of that stuff still sticks around for a long time. He also mentions that nuclear war would destroy much of the ozone layer. And that would create a rise in ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth, as we already have enough radiation. Now we're going to get more, and that'll increase skin cancer rates, especially in light-skinned people. He says the dust in the air would reflect sunlight and cool the Earth a little. He says that birds would be easily killed by radiation, and that because of that, insect populations would grow out of proportion, and that they would create agricultural disasters. He says that increased radiation will also weaken immune systems and create disease and plague. And of course, any genetic mutations would likely be lethal. On 269, he talks about the changes in warfare. So it used to be the case that you wanted to attack France. You're Britain and you want to attack France. You have to rally the troops. You have to get people. You have to go and convince people that we have to fight this war for these reasons. And there's these aspects of loyalty and nationalism and all that. So to engage in warfare and violence, you have to get other people, a lot of people, tens of thousands of people, to be loyal and to do your bidding, and to be armed and trained and then go out and fight. But in the current context of nuclear weapons, only a few people are really involved in pushing that button. You don't have to convince the nation of Canada, for example, that we need to nuke, I don't know, whatever country. Only a few of the leaders at the top, and if some of the soldiers that are in the missile silo need to make that decision. They're not going to give me a vote on that. But if we're going to be conscripted to war, they may need my compliance to do that. So you see how that's a big difference. And he continues on that. On page 269, he says that when humans lived in small groups, when our weapons were comparatively paltry, even an enraged warrior could kill only a few. As our technology improved, the means of war also improved. In the same brief interval, we also have improved. We have tempered our anger, frustration, and despair with reason. We have ameliorated on a planetary scale injustices that only recently were global and endemic. But our weapons can now kill billions. Have we improved fast enough? Are we teaching reason as effectively as we can? have we courageously studied the causes of war. This whole chapter is pretty much on the bad things about nuclear weapons, although the other side might say that nuclear weapons have actually gave us a pretty long peace. If you look at history, warfare was almost constant across the earth, and yet warfare, except in small pockets in the Middle East, is basically not happening. Europe used to be a horrible place for war. Almost every period of European history there's a war going on somewhere. But now there's only a little bit of war going on in the global scale. So, and if you have a look at Steven Pinker's recent book about the decreases in violence, it's on the Angels of Our Nature or something like that. That also says that violence is down, deaths are down, even in the 20th century compared to other times. But anyways, he says here that on page 272, it's kind of an irony, but would we argue that 10,000 targeted nuclear warheads are likely to enhance the prospects of our survival? Maybe if we were the only ones with the nuclear warheads. But when most of the world has them, and especially countries and leaders that you may not trust, that warheads then become perhaps not. And he also says on page 273, he kind of separates individual people from nations. And he says that we, the nuclear hostages, all the peoples of the earth, must educate ourselves about conventional and nuclear warfare. So he's saying, remember I was talking earlier about, used to be the case that to engage in warfare, you had to convince tens of thousands of people in your nation to go and fight. Nowadays, just a few people push buttons to shoot nuclear weapons. And yet, my consent is then not regarded. Not only is my consent not regarded to go to war, my consent is not regarded to be killed by nuclear weapons, right? So that's the point. The point is that these nuclear weapons are not really, it's not as if human survival and the fate of individuals is in the control of every individual, as it would have been if warfare was meant, or if warfare was limited to only armies fighting armies. Now you are at the fate of your nation's leaders, and if they do something stupid, that could cost your life. Like Japan, I don't know about the average Japanese citizen during World War II. Did the average Japanese citizen really want to go to war with China and the surrounding area and also hit Pearl Harbor? Did they really? I don't know the answer to that, but I assume not. And yet, all kinds of innocent Japanese people were nuked, were killed by American bombs, and to stop Japan. Is that fair? No, it's not fair. Could we be casualties in that exact regard? Absolutely. And I guess that's the fear of Carl Sagan in the 80s. And still, even in the 2010s, that you could be a casualty like that. Right? So I guess it's supposed to, again, and his point is about educating about conventional warfare. I suppose his point is that, well, we have these real forward-thinking democracies, right? And the people have the power, right? Well, how much power do you think you really have as an individual in a democracy? Not very much. Probably as much power as most people did have in history. As an individual, very little power. A vote is very little power. If you could vote on more things, that might help. If we could have a vote on going to war, that might help. I think that would be interesting if that was a global initiative. If every country's people had to vote to go to war, I think you'd annihilate war. But still, there's this fear that we can be victims from the decisions of our own nation or other foreign nations who decide to attack or invade or whatever, or use bombs. And there's a sense in which that kind of individual security, I suppose, has really never been granted, but is even worse in a time where you could just be blown up. In other times, you may be able to escape conscription, but nowadays you can't. escape a nuclear fallout unless you live in a very unless you live in a part of the world that is very obscure and no one would bother with. This is on page 284. He says that it's inevitable that every species will reach this point in which you either survive and you don't have a nuclear war, or you don't. And the reason is because early space travel with satellites uses the technology that nuclear weapons do. So he talks about the rocket boosters used to send satellites up, the same rocket boosters that would be used to send a warhead across the Earth. He mentions the radioactive, nuclear little power plants that they have, little nuclear reactors they have in the satellites for power are the same ones that are in the warheads, just in a deal amount more. But he mentions at the end here, this is on page 284, if we continue to the planets and the stars, our chauvinisms will be shaken further. We will gain a cosmic perspective. So I didn't discuss it in the video here, but he talks earlier about, in a very short amount of time, there's been this massive destruction of human ego, especially that religion has promised and trumped, maybe, that we are the center of the universe and we were created by a god and all this stuff to make man the only thing in the world and the most important thing in the world, right? Well, science has been slowly eroding that, and Carl Sagan would like us to no longer be so concerned about our trivial daily lives and even our trivial planet, maybe, and take what he calls a cosmic perspective, meaning that the future lies not in as much as what we do here, but in our relationships out there. Now, that hasn't happened yet because out there has been very minimal. We have sent some satellites to tour the solar system. We have sent some rovers to Mars and our moon, but that's it. We have a space station floating around the Earth, but that's about it. We haven't communicated with anybody outside our solar system. We have not visited outside our solar system anywhere else. We don't have any other human colonies. So our cosmic perspective has basically been zero at this point. Maybe not zero, but almost zero. Carl Sagan would like us to further do that. And I agree. I think eventually there'll be a colony on Mars. Would I be on that boat? Would I be on that ship to join it? I don't know. I hope in my lifetime, though, I see a fixed colony on Mars. I think that would be pretty neat.